By the time this single day began, the German Blitzkrieg had already rolled across Europe like a force of nature. Poland had collapsed in weeks. France had fallen faster than anyone believed possible. By the autumn of 1941, the same terrifying rhythm seemed to be playing out again as German armored columns surged deep into Soviet territory. Maps in Berlin were being updated almost daily, with front lines moving eastward at a pace that suggested Moscow was only a matter of time. To many on both sides, the outcome felt inevitable. The only question left was how quickly the Soviet defenses would crumble. But on this day, that sense of inevitability began to fracture. The German plan relied on speed above all else. Every hour mattered. Every delay threatened the entire logic of Blitzkrieg, which depended on keeping the enemy off balance and preventing them from forming a coherent defense. What the German commanders encountered instead was something they had not expected at this stage of the campaign. A line that did not immediately break. Soviet units, many of them battered remnants pulled together from previous defeats, were ordered to hold positions that, on paper, were nearly impossible to defend. There were gaps in the lines, shortages of ammunition, and little air support. Yet the order was simple and absolute. Hold for as long as you can. As dawn broke, German forces attacked with the confidence of an army that believed victory was already within reach. Tanks pushed forward. Infantry followed, and artillery pounded Soviet positions in preparation for a quick breakthrough. Under normal circumstances, this would have been enough. Earlier in the campaign, similar assaults had sent Soviet troops into full retreat within hours. But this time, the response was different. Instead of collapsing, Soviet defenders absorbed the blows and refused to give ground. Even as losses mounted and communication lines failed, much of the fighting quickly devolved into chaotic, close-range combat. Villages, tree lines, and frozen roads became deadly choke points. German armor, designed for rapid movement, found itself slowed by terrain, stubborn resistance, and mechanical strain from weeks of non-stop advance. Soviet soldiers used whatever advantages they had. Ambushes at short range, hastily dug defensive positions, and an intimate knowledge of the ground. This was not a counteroffensive. It was a deliberate act of delay, carried out with the understanding that survival was less important than time. As the hours passed, something subtle but crucial began to happen. The German timetable started to unravel. Units that were supposed to be advancing dozens of kilometers by nightfall were still locked in the same brutal engagements they had entered at sunrise. Commanders requested reinforcements and air support, but coordination was becoming increasingly difficult. Fuel and ammunition consumption rose far faster than planned, while replacement supplies lagged behind. What had been designed as a swift punch toward Moscow turned into a grinding struggle over ground that, strategically, should have been insignificant. For the Soviet side, the cost was staggering. Casualties were heavy, and entire units were effectively spent by the end of the day. Many soldiers knew they would not be relieved. Some positions were held until they were completely overrun. Yet each stand, no matter how small, forced the Germans to stop, deploy, and fight instead of racing forward. The defenders were not trying to win the battle in the traditional sense. They were buying hours, and with every passing hour, the value of their resistance grew. By afternoon, the weather itself began to compound the German problems. The ground, already difficult, became less forgiving. Vehicles bogged down, and maintenance crews struggled to keep machines operational under constant pressure. The German advance, once defined by fluid movement, now felt constrained and heavy. For the first time in the campaign, forward momentum was no longer guaranteed by superior tactics alone. It had to be fought for, meter by meter. As darkness approached, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. The breakthrough had not happened. Moscow had not been reached. A full day had been consumed by a battle that was never supposed to exist in German planning. That single lost day forced higher command to reconsider timelines that had been built on the assumption of continuous success. Even more damaging, it allowed Soviet commanders to breathe, assess, and react. Reserves that might have arrived too late were now moving into position. Defensive belts around Moscow were thickening by the hour. When the fighting finally subsided, the landscape told the story more clearly than any report. Burned-out vehicles, shattered villages, and exhausted troops marked a front line that had barely moved. On paper, the Germans could still claim progress. But psychologically and strategically, something had shifted. The Blitzkrieg had been slowed. Not by a massive counterattack, but by a refusal to collapse on a single, critical day. That day did not end the threat to Moscow. The danger remained very real. But it marked the moment when the German advance lost its sense of inevitability. The idea that Moscow would fall simply because it had to was quietly, decisively broken. And in a war where momentum often mattered more than numbers, that one day of resistance became the thin line between a city doomed to fall and a capital that would survive. What made that single day so powerful was not what happened on the battlefield alone, but what it unlocked in the days that followed. In most wars, one day rarely changes everything. But in late 1941, time itself had become a weapon. The German invasion plan was built on the assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse before winter fully arrived. Every calculation, from fuel consumption to troop endurance, was based on speed. When that speed was disrupted, even briefly, the consequences rippled outward in ways the German command had not fully prepared for. The pause created by that one day allowed Soviet leadership to do something it had been struggling to achieve for months: stabilize. Until then, decisions were being made in near panic, with fronts collapsing faster than orders could be issued. Suddenly, there was space to reorganize battered formations, reassign commanders, and clarify defensive priorities. Moscow was no longer just a symbolic target. It became the center of a deliberate, coordinated effort to hold the line. That shift, subtle at first, marked the transition from survival to resistance. Fresh Soviet forces, many of them drawn from reserves stationed deep within the country, were now able to move forward with purpose. These were not mythical reinforcements arriving overnight, but real units whose timely arrival depended on the Germans being slowed even slightly. Trains that might have been intercepted or outrun now reached their destinations. Defensive positions that had been little more than lines on a map were reinforced with men, equipment, and artillery. Each additional hour bought by that earlier battle translated into stronger defenses around the capital. At the same time, the German side began to feel the strain of a campaign that was slipping off schedule. The Blitzkrieg model worked best when opponents were disoriented and retreating. When faced with organized resistance, its weaknesses became more visible. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. And the further the Germans advanced, the harder it became to sustain momentum. The one-day delay forced logistical systems to operate under stress, amplifying shortages that had previously been manageable. Fuel, spare parts, and winter gear were already scarce, and now they were needed in greater quantities than planned. Perhaps more damaging than material shortages was the psychological impact. German troops had been conditioned to expect rapid success. For months, they had advanced almost continuously, reinforced by the belief that the Soviet defenses were on the brink of total collapse. The realization that a determined stand could stop them, even temporarily, introduced doubt. That doubt spread quietly through the ranks and up the chain of command. Orders became more cautious. Risk-taking, once central to Blitzkrieg, began to give way to hesitation. As the front stabilized, Soviet command was able to exploit this change in tempo. Defensive lines around Moscow were layered, not improvised. Anti-tank obstacles, artillery positions, and fallback zones were integrated into a coherent system designed to absorb and blunt further attacks. The city itself transformed, with civilians contributing to fortifications and logistics. What had once seemed like a desperate scramble now resembled a calculated defense, made possible only because the Germans had been denied continuous forward motion. Winter, which had been looming as an abstract concern, now became an active participant in the campaign. The delay meant that German forces were increasingly exposed to freezing temperatures without adequate preparation. Vehicles failed, weapons malfunctioned, and soldiers suffered from exhaustion and cold. The weather did not defeat the German army by itself, but it magnified every existing weakness. A campaign that had been designed to conclude before winter was now fighting against it, day after day. Crucially, the one-day delay also altered strategic perceptions beyond the immediate battlefield. For the Soviet Union, it reinforced the belief that the war could be fought and won. Morale, battered by months of retreat, began to recover. The defense of Moscow became a rallying point, both militarily and psychologically. For Germany, the failure to achieve a quick victory forced a re-evaluation of the entire Eastern campaign. What had been envisioned as a decisive blow was turning into a prolonged struggle of attrition, a type of war for which Germany was far less prepared. As weeks passed, the cumulative effect of that single lost day became clearer. The German offensive stalled within sight of Moscow but could not break through. Soviet counter-offensives, unthinkable earlier in the campaign, became possible. The momentum of the war began to shift, not dramatically overnight, but steadily and irreversibly. The Blitzkrieg, once synonymous with unstoppable speed, had been exposed as vulnerable to disruption. Looking back, it is tempting to search for grand turning points defined by massive battles or sweeping offensives. Yet the saving of Moscow hinged on something far quieter and more fragile. A single day when time was stolen from an advancing army. That day did not win the war, but it made a different outcome possible. It marked the moment when Nazi Germany's vision of a swift conquest of the Soviet Union began to unravel, and when the path toward eventual defeat first came into view.